Rogue Tulips Consulting presents our podcast, Nonprofit Conversations, with your host, Cecilia Supp, CAE, Principal and Founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. Welcome to episode 170 with our guest, Wendy Toyama of AAHPM. Today's topic, success tips for the CEO interview. It's Monday, October 24th, 2022. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe. Hey everybody, it's Monday, October 24th, and that means it's time for another episode of Nonprofit Conversations. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp. I'm a certified association executive, and I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. We work exclusively with nonprofits of all types. I encourage you all out there who listen, whether you listen every week or a couple times a month, please remember to subscribe. And if you like a episode a lot, please share it with your friends on your social media networks. I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience, wherever you may be. And this week, we're so excited to have back, after too long a break, one of our favorite guests, Wendy Toyama, who is a two-time CSE, Chief Staff Executive, for those of you outside the profession. And she's here this week to share her tips for successful interviews to get that top job. Wendy, welcome back. It's been too long. Would you like to say hello and tell the audience a little about yourself?
Hi, everyone. This is a topic I love, and in part because it is tough to land that first CEO job. And I will tell you, I've probably interviewed for 22 or 23 CEO positions. And so I like to share with everyone tips to help them as they encounter that. So really looking forward to our conversation today, Cecilia.
Oh, I am too, Wendy. I have been a CSE one time, and was a great experience. Generally, I have to say, it didn't end the way I would have liked, but that's another story. But I really learned a lot going through the interview process. So what are some of the tips you would give to somebody who's interviewing for their first CSE position?
Yeah, I think the first thing is it is a very different process. And I think folks may not be prepared for that. It is a longer process. There are different steps in the process that have different roles. The expectations of how you interview is different. So it is just different. It is a group interview. I like to tell everyone, make sure you're engaging with every single person in the group. Don't exclude someone in your eye contact. But it's a different process. I think that's the first thing I want everyone to know. And because it's different, getting out there and practicing and skill building is important. So I think you want to be authentic in the interview process. You don't want to just go if you're not interested, but the more that you can interview, the better you'll become at it.
I think that's a good point, because when I was interviewing for several different CSE jobs before I landed one, that's how I approached the interview process. Even if I don't get it, I'm learning something.
Exactly. Right.
So what are some of the things you learned? You said you interviewed a lot. So what are some you learned in that process?
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is they really are looking for you to come in and bring a critical eye. And what I mean by that is early on, I was interviewing for an organization. They took me to their a big annual meeting. And in the interview, they asked how I thought it was. And I complimented them. I said, it was great, yada, yada, yada. Well, honestly, it wasn't great. They had Rudy Giuliani speak. That was a little bit controversial, but I didn't point out anything that they could have improved. And boards are really looking to hear, what are your ideas? So there's a way that you can provide feedback and that critical eye without, you have to be careful. You don't know who on the board is really supportive or instrumental in creating something, but they are looking for you to come in and say, I was on your website and I think that could better depict who you are. It didn't have photo, they're looking for that. So I think that was something that surprised me. I got that as feedback from a recruiter.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I know what you mean, because sometimes, when I'm working with a new client as a consultant, it's a similar situation. There's something of an interview, right? And you kind of say, well, so you kind of learn that delicate balance of like, well, this worked well, but in the future you could do it this way or tweak it or something. But I'm with you. You definitely don't want to come in and be like, oh my gosh, your website's so ugly. And I could
No, right. You have to do it very respectfully, but they want to see you starting to flex that CEO muscle. Like, what would this person come in and help us do?
yeah.
You
And
know,
so, and when do you have a CAE? So
I
did,
do.
did you find that that helped push your resume to the top of the pile and help you get
Uh,
more?
it did for my first job for sure. They told me they were looking for an association professional. It was a multidisciplinary medical association. They knew what they didn't know. Not all boards are like that. So in some cases it will, but not all. So for those who don't have it yet, that doesn't mean you can't step in and interview for the CEO job. But for those who do have it, I think it can be a differentiator in some situations, definitely.
So when you were preparing for the different interviews,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier something about the group interview, which is an excellent point.
Mhm.
But didn't you have to go through levels to
Yes.
get to
Yeah.
that? So what kind of levels did you see before the group?
So for many CEO positions, there is a recruiter that's working on the job. And so the first step is usually with a gatekeeper at the recruiter's organization. And it took me a while to realize they're just gathering data. Like, so they're going to ask a lot of questions. And what they're doing is ensuring that you have the fundamental functions and skill sets that the board is looking for. Once I sort of understood the purpose of that interview, I was able to handle that a little differently. It's often one-on-one. It could be on the phone. And you may or may not get past that. But that's sort of like a gatekeeper interview. And if you pass that, then you may talk to the principal recruiter on the position. And that actually is a job where they're trying to prepare you to kind of help you put your best foot forward. So again, very different purpose. And then usually after that, you would go into an interview with the search committee. Some groups have a few more steps than that, but and some organizations, my first CEO position actually did not use a recruiter. So they're different, but mhm.
I was going to ask you that. I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to ask if every interview was with a recruiter or with a volunteer run search committee. The position that I had was a volunteer search committee. They did themselves. So what differences do you see between a volunteer search committee and working with a recruiter?
Yeah, I think the recruiters invested in putting forward good candidates. That means you are among a handful. You may or may not be their favorite candidate for the job. They're not necessarily advocating for you, they're working for the client. But they are helping you. So I think one difference when you have a recruiter is they can help you. You can get questions answered by the recruiter before as you prepare for the interview. When you don't have a recruiter, you need to do all that preparation on your own and dig that info up. And what I found is sometimes when it's a volunteer group, which was like my first one, they may not know what the reserve level is. Actually, I've asked recruiters and they have to go find it out. So, but I think you sometimes step into an interview when there's a recruiter with a little more insight. And I think when you don't have a recruiter, it's incumbent on you to really figure out what are the important things I need to learn in the interview, right? We focus so much on presenting ourselves, but it's a two-way street, right? So I think when there's not a recruiter involved, you really have to think about what do I have to find out about this to know that it's a place I can work and be successful.
Well, and of course, with any interview process, you're also interviewing them, like you just mentioned.
Of
You're
course,
learning
yeah.
about them, you're doing all this work yourself. What are some common red flags that you have seen, or red
Oh.
flags that are red flags to you about, well, maybe it's okay if I don't move on in this process?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's if the search committee is huge.
Oh, that's a
Um, yeah, that's a bit of a red flag. Um, I think I think it's important to focus in on what values you're trying to uncover. So, and have questions related to that. So for me, DEI is really important. So I'll ask a question to see how they handle it. And if they can't handle that question, that's a red flag. A question I got from my husband that I love is, what's the board staff relationship? And sometimes that answer is super awkward. Or it's maybe it's great, like, huh. So I think there are questions you can use to uncover red flags. Trying to think of other things I've seen. I think so much of it is how you feel when you're with the search committee. It's a proxy for the board. And you're going to be working very closely with the board. So how does it feel? I think is important. I don't know. I think red flags are so specific to the organizations. And I think this goes a little bit back to preparation. So it goes without saying you have to prepare, but what does that mean? And I would say that means you should definitely look at their 990. You should look at their financials. I was at one organization where one of the key staff employees was the daughter of the prior CEO. And so I asked about that and they're like, how did you know? And I'm like, it's disclosed in the 990, and they're like, oh, so you can get a lot of good information. So I think you have to do that. You have to do research on the salary. And then there are a few things, I'm going to give you a few of my little tips.
Okay.
I always try to talk to a member,
Mm.
which I think is great. And then I had one interview when they said, what would your tagline be for our organization? And I'm like, oh my gosh, because what I do to prepare is, think about a dozen questions, 15 questions, and have my answers all set for those. This wasn't on my list, but I added it to my list. And now every time I went into an interview, I'd kind of think of what's my tagline for the organization. So those are two things that I think if you prepare can set you apart from other candidates.
That's a really good idea,
Mhm.
especially adding questions as you're going along
Mhm.
through that interview process. I can give a couple red flags.
Oh,
If,
good. Please do.
if it's a volunteer search committee
Mhm.
and it's a very small group, that's the board's very hands-on, and you ask them how much
Oh.
is in the reserve fund, and they say, well, we have this much money in the checking account. I would
Oh,
recommend
yeah.
continuing your search because the checking account and the reserve fund are not the same thing.
Right.
Another thing on looking at financials, which is very important, but it also depends on how the financials are presented. So like if
Yeah.
it's a C3 membership organization that's taking restricted and unrestricted fund donations, and they're listing them all on the same balance sheet and making it look like you have more money than you actually do, I would suggest you consider moving on because those are things that I've seen. And it causes a lot of trouble down the road because especially with the board that is not financially savvy when it comes to
Right.
nonprofit
Right.
money management, which are different things from what they do at work.
It is.
So that's
Well, and you reminded me of another one. I always look for a revenue mix. So I will only work for organizations with a diversity of revenue streams. So if you are going to an organization and all their money is from one source, whether it's a large grant, a large meeting, only member dues, that really is risky. And they could be a board that's looking to diversify revenue streams and they're bringing you in to do that. Then you know what you're walking into. But that's something I always look at.
That's a really good point. And the point you just made is a good one too. Maybe if they know they need to diversify and they're asking you, can you help us do that? That's a little different situation. Another tip to watch is how the board members interviewing you interact with more junior staff.
Yep.
Because
or with each other.
That's another thing, because we have to remember we don't know the culture we're walking into or those relationships. And sometimes somebody who's been there 15 years but isn't in a C-suite position has way more sway and influence than you might imagine. And they can actually influence the selection process of who their new boss is going to be. So there's a lot of little things like that. And I don't mean to sound negative because it is exciting to be a chief staff executive. I enjoyed the heck out of it. Learned a lot, did a lot of good for that organization. But I'm also able to share some tips with people about, well, these are things that didn't go well. But so Wendy, as you're looking at your position, okay, so you get the position, you've got the offer. So one of the questions that I hear a lot from people who are new CSEs is, should I have a contract or letter of agreement? Should I get an attorney to help me? with the letter of agreement or contract. So what is your point of view on that?
Yeah, so you should. And my point of view is that it's an investment in yourself. If you are landing a top staff level position, you're going to be moving into a different pay scale. It might be scary to think about spending that sort of money, but you do want an attorney to look at that contract. I think it would be irresponsible to not do that. And I think you do want a contract. The question is, do you want a 2-year, 5-year, and how do some of those things look? I will also say, I think that's an intimidating part of being a CEO for the first time is having a contract. And I think the attorney can help take some of the mystique out of that for you as well. You can feel more informed, equipped, and ready. I will say I am at an AMC now, an Association Management Center. We don't have a contract because I'm an employee of the AMC. So it's a little different. So there are situations where you may not have a contract, but I would recommend it because really you want to have some freedom in the first year to be able to build the relationship and build a on-ramp. And you want to not worry about the shoe dropping tomorrow, which, there's still usually there's something in the contract about that, but it provides confidence and a basis for trust with you and the board.
I think that's a really good point. And because it is important, so everybody understands, it's like anything, everybody understands what their role and responsibilities are to each other.
Yeah, it sets expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's anything. And we talk about that a lot with volunteer management, make sure our volunteers understand their role and responsibility. So a lot of what we do goes across the organization, whether we're in the chief staff executive position for the first time or the second time or the 10th time, and how all these things relate to each other. So before we wrap up, because I can't believe we're coming near the end of our episode already, I want to ask you kind of a fun question.
Sure.
Can you think of a funny question you've ever been asked in an interview?
Oh,
like something that really stuck with you and you kind of chuckle about later?
Gosh. I am not coming up with one right now. I'm trying to think of, I think sometimes you get asked something like, what do you do in your spare time? Or, and it's not funny. I don't think that's what you're asking, but it feels out of place because you're very focused on, I want to demonstrate I can be a CEO and all this. But the truth is they want to get to know who you are. So I think sometimes those questions catch us off guard or feel funny. Why do they care what I do in my spare time? But I think it's an attempt to try to get to know who you are.
Right. No,
I don't know. You must have one or you wouldn't have asked. What's yours?
No, well, of course, I was just curious. Because frankly, I'll be honest, one's not coming to mind. I'm sure.
Okay. I was like
questions before.
Maybe the listeners can send them in.
Yeah, that would be a great comment, listeners. When you hear this episode, if you have a funny interview question you've been asked, I do know sometimes, like when I'm talking with people about appropriate questions in the interview process at any level, you have to be very careful about what you ask. I was actually in an interview with a coworker one time. We were interviewing a potential candidate for an admin position. And they had just seen a Barbara Walters special the night before, and they used one of Barbara Walters' questions for Katharine Hepburn, which was, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? So to me, it's like I didn't get asked that, but I was in the interview, right? And so it's like, no, that's actually a pretty funny question. I do think it's nice if they ask, well, what do you do outside of work? Yeah. Because I think that also says the board doesn't expect you to work all the time. Some boards do. They think you're on call 24 hours.
Well, that's true. That's true.
So that's, so I kind of like that. It's like, well, what kind of things do you like to do? How do you spend your time when you're not representing our organization? So, well, Wendy, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And I want to say to the audience, I may have thrown out some what might seem like negative examples, but we have to be prepared for everything in the interview process. So most interview processes are pretty positive, pretty consistent, but we do have these like things that we have to be aware of. And over the years, I've had conversations with new CSEs, which is why I was so excited Wendy could come today and talk about tips for success, because they're not always prepared for these things. And so what we're trying to do is prepare you for a good interview process and a good interview experience, and to learn from it as you're going forward. So Wendy, as we do at the end of every episode, we would like to ask you, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And then if they want to reach out with you and get some more advice, how could they reach you?
I think it's really important from the very beginning to think about what executive presence you're going to bring with you. And so people say that and you're like, what does that mean? So it isn't just what you wear, how you speak, and how you present yourself. It's even things like, do I have a big schleppy bag? Do I spread a lot of papers out? Am I cleaning up after myself? You really want to come in. I had a colleague who's an executive. He never is in a meeting with anything. He just sits and listens. So I think you want to think about what that means for you and what kind of executive presence you want to bring. And then, I would say one last tip, close. Make sure you tell the search committee, I would love to go to the next step. I would love to be a part of your team. And I had a coach say, don't say I would be perfect, because that's a little presumptuous. Express your enthusiasm. If you're excited about the job, say that. I'm super excited about this interview and I would love to be your CEO. It's such a simple thing, but so many people don't close. Always be closing. Anyway, if you do want to reach out to me, please feel free to email me, and I will say my email address. It's W for Wendy and Toyama, Toyama, at AAHPM, which is for the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. So aahpm.org. So do feel free to reach out. I always love to help people when they're trying to advance in their career.
That is a great summary and a great thought to take away, Wendy. Thank you. And I agree wholeheartedly on the close, because I have not moved forward in other interview processes before I was interviewing for CSE because I didn't do the close, and they thought I wasn't interested when I really was. So just say what Wendy said, and that's perfect advice. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Always fun to talk with you, Cecilia.
You too, Wendy. Thanks for coming back. And we'll definitely have you back sooner than a year. I can't wait a whole year. It's like, oh my gosh. And it seems like just last week we were waving at each other in Nashville.
I know, right?
On the house players, and that was just August. So
much fun.
Yeah, it was. Well, thank you again, everyone. I want to thank Wendy Toyama for coming to share her really valuable tips and insights on the CSE process, the interview process, and ways to be successful. So we have to go rogue for now. Thank you all for joining us and listening in. Please do remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast service if you haven't already. If you would like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your company bloom outside the box, check out our website at roguetulips.com. If you're interested in CAE education, check out our education program, the 501c League. It has its own website, the501cleague.net. We have education for CAE candidates and current CAEs. Thanks, everybody. On behalf of myself and Wendy, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.